The air in the gilded scepter was not merely conditioned, it was curated. It carried the scent of old money and freshly shaved black truffles, a fragrance so potent it seemed to cling to the velvet drapes and settle into the deep grain of the mahogany paneling. Light did not simply illuminate the room. It dripped from colossal crystal chandeliers, fracturing into 1,000 tiny rainbows that danced across the polished silver and bone-white porcelain. Each clink of a fork against a plate was a delicate, musical note in a symphony of immense wealth, a sound that echoed the hushed, conspiratorial tones of the men and women who conducted the world's business between bites of seared foie gras and sips of $1,000 Bordeaux. They were gods on a temporary Olympus, their faces cast in the warm, forgiving glow of the ambient light, their laughter low and confident. The staff moved among them like ghosts in tailored uniforms, their presence felt only in the silent refilling of a water glass or the seamless removal of a finished plate. They were trained to be invisible, to be efficient, to be nothing more than a pair of disembodied hands, ensuring the frictionless comfort of the elite. This was not a restaurant, it was a sanctuary, a golden bubble, where the harsh realities of the outside world could not penetrate, and power was the only currency that truly mattered. Among these specters of service moved Elena Reyes. To the casual observer, she was indistinguishable from the others, a model of professional grace. Her black uniform was immaculate, her movements economical and precise, her expression a carefully constructed mask of pleasant neutrality. She navigated the narrow channels between tables with a dancer's poise, balancing a heavy silver tray as if it were weightless. But beneath this placid surface, a different reality churned. Her mind was a fortress, a place where the serene emptiness required of her job could not reach. While her hands worked, her brain cataloged, analyzed, and remembered. She saw not just patrons, but complex networks of power. She recognized the subtle tells of a lie, the fractional hesitation before a commitment, the predatory gleam in the eye of a CEO closing a deal. The gilded scepter was her prison, but it was also her observation post. Every night she absorbed the language of her captors, the casual cruelty veiled in corporate jargon, the utter disregard for the lives they casually rearranged on their ledgers. She was a ghost, yes, but a ghost that listened, a ghost that saw, and a ghost that never, ever forgot. Her invisibility was a cloak she wore to survive, but it was lined with the heavy fabric of memory. As she poured a stream of sparkling water into a flute of hand-blown glass, the pristine clarity of the liquid would momentarily transport her to another room. One that smelled not of truffles, but of antiseptic and despair. The rhythmic, gentle chime of the crystal was drowned out by the relentless, electronic beep of a heart monitor, a sound that had become the soundtrack to her life. In her mind's eye she saw her father, a man whose hands, once dusty with the wisdom of old books, now lay still and pale upon a sterile white sheet. He had been a man of stories, the proprietor of a small-town bookstore that was more a community living room than a business. His ruin had not been a dramatic explosion, but a slow, suffocating squeeze, executed by a flurry of legal documents filled with impenetrable clauses and signed by a name she would see in her nightmares, Croft Global. The stress of that hostile, predatory takeover had shattered his health, causing a massive stroke that stole his words, his mobility, and the light from his eyes. Now Elena's life was a frantic race to pay for the machines that kept him breathing, for the care that offered him a sliver of dignity. That was her fuel, the silent, furious engine that drove her through each demeaning shift. The irony was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. The education her father had sacrificed so much for, the one that had made her the star of her Columbia Law School class, was now utterly useless, a dormant weapon locked away. She, who could deconstruct a fraudulent, leveraged buyout from a single sentence overheard in passing, was now tasked with remembering who preferred still water over sparkling. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument designed to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of corporate and estate law, was now occupied with memorizing the daily specials. Sometimes a scrap of conversation would drift over from a nearby table, a mention of a poison pill defense or a golden parachute clause, and for a fleeting, painful moment, the old Elena would awaken. Her brain would ignite, running through case law, citing SEC regulations, and identifying legal loopholes with lightning speed. She could see the entire predatory dance laid out before her, the moves and countermoves, the elegant violence of it all. Then, the moment would pass, and she would be back in her body, a waitress holding a silver tray, the brilliant legal prodigy once again submerged beneath the quiet, efficient servant. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The delicate equilibrium of the room shifted when Julian Croft arrived. It was not a grand entrance, but the atmosphere itself seemed to contract, to hold its breath. He didn't walk into the restaurant, he claimed it. He moved with an unhurried, predatory grace, his custom-tailored suit, a dark armor that seemed to absorb the light around him. His lawyers and associates trailed in his wake like pilot fish, their expressions a mixture of fear and sycophantic admiration. He didn't acknowledge the maitre d' who rushed to greet him, but simply waved a dismissive hand toward his preferred table, a prime booth in the corner that offered a commanding view of the entire room. He treated the staff as if they were furniture, his eyes sweeping past them without a flicker of recognition. This was Julian Croft, the heir apparent to the Croft global empire, a man who had been born on third base and was convinced he had hit a triple. His arrogance was not a personality trait, it was the very air he breathed, an unshakable conviction in his own superiority that radiated from him like a toxic heat, wilting everything and everyone in his immediate vicinity. Elena felt a familiar cold dread snake its way into her stomach as she saw he was seated in her section. She had served him before and knew the drill. He was demanding, impatient, and treated every request as an imposition, every server as a personal serf. As she approached the table, his voice, a low and confident baritone, cut through the restaurant's decorous hum. He was speaking loudly, with no regard for the privacy of his conversation or the comfort of those around him. The topic, as she began to pour the wine he had ordered without looking at her, was his father, the legendary and now dying tycoon, Alistair Croft. But there was no grief in his tone, no trace of filial sorrow. There was only the cold, hard calculus of a corporate takeover. He spoke of his father's charitable pledges not as a legacy to be honored, but as a liability to be neutralized. He detailed, with undisguised glee, the complex legal instruments he was employing to invalidate the old man's wishes, to redirect the vast fortune intended for hospitals and research foundations directly into his own coffers. Her hands remained steady, a testament to years of practiced control, but inside, a quiet storm was gathering. She listened as Julian, eager to impress his legal team, began to flaunt his knowledge, using arcane terminology to describe his machinations. He spoke of clawback provisions, of challenging testamentary capacity, of exploiting loopholes in trust law so obscure they were barely taught in advanced seminars. It was a masterful, if monstrous, display of legal maneuvering, designed to dismantle a dying man's legacy piece by piece. He was a vulture picking at a carcass before it had even grown cold. As Elena reached across the table to refill his water glass, her movement, subtle and unobtrusive, finally drew his attention. He paused, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He saw her not as a person, but as a prop, an audience for his intellectual vanity. He looked directly at her, his eyes full of a casual, dismissive cruelty that was more insulting than any overt anger. The world seemed to slow down. The ambient noise of the restaurant faded into a dull roar in Elena's ears. She saw the condescending glint in Julian Croft's eyes, the self-satisfied curl of his lip as he prepared to deliver his little piece of theater. It was in that frozen moment that the past and present collided with the force of a physical blow. As he opened his mouth, the image of his signature, a sharp and arrogant scrawl on the foreclosure documents that had destroyed her family, burned itself onto the back of her eyelids. She could smell the ink and paper, feel the crushing weight of that legal pronouncement. This man, this titan of industry, was not just another arrogant customer. He was the architect of her family's ruin, the ghost who had haunted her every waking moment for years. He looked at her, a waitress in a cheap uniform, and saw nothing. He had no idea that he was staring into the eyes of the one person on earth who knew exactly what kind of monster he was, and who possessed the knowledge to prove it. Then he spoke, his voice dripping with condescension, launching the words that would shatter the quiet truce she had made with her life. "Try to keep up, sweetheart," he said, the word sweetheart landing like a slap. "We're discussing a testamentary bypass trust, not your tip money." A profound, unnatural stillness descended upon Julian Croft's table, a pocket of absolute silence in a room designed for ambient noise. The universe, for a moment, had narrowed to the space between a billionaire heir and the waitress he had just tried to dismiss. Elena did not move. She simply placed the heavy silver water pitcher on the table with a soft, deliberate click that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the sudden quiet. The gesture was not one of submission, but of conclusion. She had finished a task, and now she was beginning another. She lifted her head, and for the first time that evening, she allowed her true self to look out through her eyes. The pleasant, neutral mask of the service professional dissolved, replaced by an expression of crystalline, analytical calm. There was no anger in her gaze, no fear, only the placid, unnerving focus of a master strategist assessing a flawed opening move on a chessboard. Her posture subtly realigned itself, her spine straightening, her shoulders squaring, a subconscious shift from the deferential carriage of a servant to the composed authority of an expert in her own domain. It was a transformation so complete and instantaneous that it was utterly disorienting to the men who witnessed it. They were looking at the same woman in the same black uniform, yet she was an entirely different person. Her voice when she spoke was the most shocking part of the metamorphosis. The soft, accommodating tone she had used just moments before was gone, replaced by a voice that was level, measured, and carried an intrinsic weight of authority. It was the voice of a lecturer, a litigator, a person accustomed to being the most intelligent person in any room and having no need to prove it. "The testamentary bypass trust you're proposing is flawed, Mr. Croft," she stated, the words clean and sharp, stripped of any emotional inflection. She did not raise her voice, yet it cut through the silence and commanded the absolute attention of everyone at the table. Her eyes remained locked on his, unblinking. It was not a challenge, it was a diagnosis. She was a physician informing a patient of a terminal, self-inflicted illness. Julian's smirk faltered, a flicker of confusion clouding his features. His lawyers, who had been enjoying the casual humiliation of the staff, now leaned forward, their professional instincts overriding their surprise. They recognized the language, the cadence, the sheer, unadulterated confidence of a legal peer, and its appearance in this context was as jarring as finding a diamond in a dustbin. Inside Elena, the world was a maelstrom of controlled fire. The insult had not just stung her, it had been a key turning a lock deep within her soul, releasing years of suppressed knowledge, grief, and righteous fury. The image of her father in his hospital bed, his brilliant mind trapped in a silent prison, flashed behind her eyes, not as a source of weakness, but as a wellspring of strength. This man, this arrogant child playing with legal fire, was a pale imitation of the corporate evil that had destroyed her family. She was not merely correcting a legal error, she was defending her father's honor, channeling the intellectual legacy he had sacrificed everything to give her. Each word she prepared to speak was a tribute to him, a weapon forged in the fires of her own private hell. She felt a strange, liberating clarity, the fog of her double life burning away to reveal the core of her identity. She was Elena Reyes, Columbia Law, top of her class, and she was about to deliver a lesson that would not soon be forgotten. The gilded scepter with its opulent trappings faded away. and she was standing in a courtroom, the only one that mattered, the court of truth. She continued, her voice never wavering from its calm, surgical precision. Given the revised 2017 tax code on generational skips, which your counsel has apparently overlooked, you've structured it as a taxable gift. She gestured almost imperceptibly with her head toward the two lawyers, who now looked as if they had been struck by lightning. The statement was an elegant, brutal intellectual takedown, dismissing their competence without a single overt insult. This creates a massive, seven-figure liability that would not only be contested by the IRS, but would, more importantly, give the hospital's Foundation for Pediatric Research immediate legal standing to sue the estate into insolvency. She paused, letting the full weight of her words land. She had not just pointed out a mistake, she had completely unraveled his entire monstrous scheme, exposing its foundational weakness with three perfect, devastating sentences. She had shown him that his plan to steal from sick children was not just morally bankrupt, but also, and perhaps worse in his eyes, intellectually incompetent. She had held his arrogance up to the light and revealed it to be nothing more than cheap, breakable glass. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer still. It was heavy, suffocating, charged with the electric shock of a public execution. Julian Croft's face was a canvas of warring emotions. The initial confusion had morphed into disbelief, which was now rapidly curdling into a dark, mottled flush of pure, unadulterated rage. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. He, Julian Croft, had been corrected, dismantled, and intellectually neutered by a waitress. The sheer, cosmic impossibility of the event was too much for his ego to process. It was a wound so deep and so personal that it bypassed reason and went straight to the primal core of his being. His lawyers were frozen, their faces pale with a mixture of professional horror at their own oversight and a dawning, terrified respect for the woman standing before them. They had just witnessed their multimillionaire client be intellectually disemboweled by their server, and they knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that every single word she had spoken was absolutely, irrefutably correct. The dam of Julian's composure finally broke. It was not a crack, but a violent, explosive rupture. A strangled, guttural sound escaped his throat as he surged to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the polished floor. His face was now a mask of crimson fury, his eyes bulging with a hatred that was almost reptilian. He snatched the heavy linen napkin from his lap and hurled it onto the table, scattering silverware. "Manager!" he bellowed, his voice a raw, ugly roar that silenced the entire restaurant. Every head turned. The symphony of wealth was shattered, replaced by a single, discordant shriek of wounded pride. "Get her out of my sight," he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at Elena, his voice thick with venom. "She's fired, now." The words were not a request. They were an imperial command, the desperate act of a king trying to reassert his authority after being exposed as a fool. He needed to erase her, to annihilate her presence, because as long as she stood there, calm and composed, she was a living monument to his humiliation. The restaurant manager, a man named Dubois, who prided himself on his unflappable demeanor, scurried toward the table, his face a mess of panic and obsequious apology. He had seen tantrums from the rich and powerful before, but this was different. This was a primal display of ego-driven savagery. He didn't even ask what had happened. Julian Croft was a name that could make or break a business like this with a single phone call. Dubois' only priority was placating the enraged titan. He turned to Elena, his eyes pleading with her to simply disappear, to not make things worse. "Miss, please," he stammered, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchens. But Elena did not flinch. She met Julian's furious glare with her own unwavering, analytical gaze. In that final, silent exchange, a new contract was signed between them. He had drawn a line, and she had crossed it. This was no longer about a job or an insult. It was about a war he had just unwittingly declared, a war he had no idea he was profoundly, catastrophically unequipped to fight. Her exit was a study in quiet dignity. She did not protest, she did not argue, she simply turned and walked away, escorted by a mortified Dubois who kept murmuring apologies under his breath. She could feel the collective gaze of the entire restaurant on her back. 100 pairs of eyes watching the public expulsion of the servant who had dared to speak truth to power. They saw a waitress being fired. They had no idea they were witnessing the birth of a reckoning. As she passed through the swinging doors that led from the gilded cage of the dining room into the steamy, chaotic reality of the kitchen, she did not look back. The sounds of clattering pans and shouting chefs washed over her, a world away from the curated tranquility she had just left. She untied the apron, the symbol of her servitude, and placed it on a steel counter. She was no longer a ghost in the machine. She was the ghost in the machine, the unseen force that was about to bring the entire edifice of Croft Global crashing down. The cold night air of New York City was a slap in the face, a brutal return to reality. The door of the Gilded Scepter clicked shut behind her, sealing her off from the world of warmth, wealth, and, most importantly, her income. The adrenaline that had surged through her veins began to recede, replaced by a creeping, icy dread that started in the pit of her stomach and spread through her limbs. The full weight of what had just happened crashed down upon her. She was unemployed. The steady stream of cash, the lifeblood that paid for the machines keeping her father alive, had been severed. She leaned against the cold brick of the building, the sounds of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a subway deep beneath her feet, the laughter from a nearby bar, all seeming to mock her sudden, terrifying vulnerability. The face of her father, peaceful in his medicated sleep, swam in her vision, and for the first time that night, a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear ran through her. The walk home to her tiny, fifth-floor walk-up in Queens was a journey through a landscape of rising panic. Every step echoed with the cold, hard numbers that now governed her life. The monthly cost of the long-term care facility was $4,700. The specialized medications were another $900. The supplemental physical therapy, the only thing that kept his muscles from completely atrophying, was $600. The figures spun in her mind, a dizzying, merciless vortex of debt and obligation. She had been treading water for years, her head just barely above the surface, and Julian Croft had just casually, carelessly pushed her under. The satisfaction of her intellectual victory felt hollow now, a foolish indulgence she could not afford. What good was being right if it meant her father would suffer? The fury that had empowered her moments ago was now replaced with a gnawing, acidic guilt. She had let her pride speak, and in doing so, she had potentially signed her father's death warrant. She pushed open the door to her apartment, the familiar scent of old books and disinfectant, a weak comfort. The place was sparse, almost monastic, every piece of furniture second-hand, every spare dollar funneled into her father's care. On a small, cluttered desk, a single framed photograph stood as a silent testament to the life that had been stolen. It showed her and her father on the day she was accepted into Columbia, both of them beaming, standing in front of his bookstore, The Story Keeper. He was a man full of life, his eyes crinkling with laughter, a dusting of flour from a morning pastry on his worn sweater. He was a man made of stories, and Croft Global had ripped every last page out of his book, leaving only a tragic, empty binding. Seeing that image, that ghost of the man he was, did not comfort her. It twisted the knife of her guilt deeper into her heart. She had failed him then, unable to stop the legal machine that crushed him, and she had failed him again tonight. She sank into a worn armchair, the springs groaning in protest, and let the full force of her despair wash over her. She felt small, powerless, a tiny, insignificant cog crushed by a vast, indifferent machine. For a few dark minutes, she allowed herself to drown in the hopelessness of it all. Julian Croft would go on with his life, his evening momentarily disrupted, but ultimately unchanged. He would forget her name by morning, dismissing her as nothing more than an impertinent servant. He would continue his ascent, built on the wreckage of lives like hers, and he would never face a single consequence. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The system was rigged, the game was fixed, and she had just been thrown out of the arena for pointing out that the Emperor was not only naked, but also a fool. The fight seemed impossible, a fool's errand. But then, something shifted deep within her. As the image of Julian's sneering, arrogant face swam back into her mind, superimposed over the smiling face of her father in the photograph, the despair began to change its chemical composition. The water of her grief began to freeze, solidifying into something hard, sharp, and unbreakably cold. It was the memory of his signature on the foreclosure documents, the casual, arrogant flourish of the pen that had signed away her father's life. Tonight had not been a random, isolated incident. It was a continuation of the same crime, perpetrated by the same man. He had not just insulted a waitress. He had, for the second time, attacked her family. The guilt she felt did not vanish, but it was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of pure, glacial rage. A rage so profound and so focused that it burned away all fear, all doubt, all hesitation. A new clarity settled over her, quiet and absolute. She would not be a victim. Not anymore. Julian Croft had made a fatal error, the classic mistake of a predator who fails to properly identify its prey. He thought he had swatted a fly, but he had just poked a sleeping dragon. Her legal mind, dormant for so long, now roared to life, not with the abstract thrill of intellectual puzzles, but with the singular, ferocious purpose of a weapon being unsheathed for a righteous war. She stood up, her movements no longer weary, but filled with a newfound energy. She walked to the back of her small closet, pulling out a large, dusty footlocker that had remained sealed since the day she left Columbia. It was a time capsule of a life she had been forced to abandon, a tomb for the woman she was supposed to be. With a deep breath, she unlatched the heavy brass clasps. The lid creaked open, releasing the faint, nostalgic scent of old paper, ink, and ambition. Inside, nestled among sweaters and personal keepsakes, were her law books, torts, contracts, civil procedure, and at the very top, a massive, well-worn volume, Advanced Corporate and Trust Law. Her notebooks were there too, their pages filled with her precise, meticulous handwriting, deconstructing complex cases, outlining legal arguments, challenging the opinions of judges and professors. It was all there, the arsenal she had spent years building. Seeing it, touching the worn covers of the books, was like shaking hands with a part of herself she thought was dead forever. A quiet, determined smile touched her lips for the first time that night. Julian Croft had taken her job. In return, she was going to take his entire world. She rummaged through a side pocket of the trunk, her fingers searching for a small, worn leather card case. She found it, flipping it open to reveal a handful of old business cards from her past life. Her fingers brushed past the cards of fellow students and internship supervisors until they landed on the one she was looking for. The embossed letters were simple, elegant, and authoritative. Professor Evan Albright, Columbia Law School. He had been her mentor, the one who had seen her raw talent and pushed her harder than anyone else. He had called her departure from the school a tragedy, a profound loss to the legal profession. She remembered his last words to her. "If you ever decide to come back to the fight, Elena, you call me. The world needs minds like yours." She pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the numbers. The fight had just come to her. She dialed the number, her heart pounding a steady, rhythmic drum against her ribs. It was late, but she knew he was a night owl, more at home in a library than in his own bed. He answered on the third ring, his voice exactly as she remembered it, a warm, gravelly baritone that radiated intelligence and quiet authority. "Albright," he said simply. For a moment she couldn't speak, the reality of what she was about to do settling upon her. "Professor Albright," she began, her voice a little shaky at first, but gaining strength with each word. "It's Elena Reyes." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then a sound of genuine surprise and pleasure. "Elena," he said, the warmth in his voice palpable. "I'll be damned. I was just citing one of your old papers to a student this afternoon. To what do I owe the honor?" She took a deep breath. "I need your help, Professor," she said. "I've just been fired from my waitressing job by a man named Julian Croft." She spent the next 20 minutes laying it all out, her voice calm and methodical, presenting the facts of the evening as if she were delivering an opening statement to a jury. She recounted the conversation she had overheard, the legal flaw she had identified in Croft's plan, the public humiliation, and the firing. She spoke with the detached precision of a seasoned litigator, leaving out the fear and the despair, focusing only on the actionable intelligence. When she finished, there was a long silence on the line. She could almost hear the gears turning in her old mentor's brilliant mind, connecting the dots, assessing the strategic landscape. He knew the Croft name, of course. Everyone did. Alistair Croft was a legend, and his son Julian was known in legal and financial circles as a ruthless, if unsubtle, operator. Finally, Professor Albright spoke, his voice no longer just warm, but charged with a new, excited energy. "Elena, he didn't just fire you. The arrogant fool handed you the sword." He explained that he had retired from teaching 2 years ago, and now ran a small, privately funded nonprofit called the Corporate Accountability Project. They were white-collar crusaders, a team of forensic accountants and legal experts who built cases against the kinds of powerful executives who believed they were above the law. "We have resources, Elena," he said, his voice rising with intensity. "Databases, private investigators, a network of informants inside some of the biggest firms in the country. We have the tools. What we've been missing is a case this clean, with a protagonist this compelling. This is a gift." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over Elena. She was not alone. For the first time in years, she had an ally, a powerful one who understood the battlefield she was about to step onto. "What's the next move, Professor?" she asked, her voice now steady and firm, the voice of a soldier ready for her orders. "The next move," Albright replied, "is that you come to my office tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp. We are going to dig. You overheard him plotting to defraud a charity, which is a good start. But you and I both know that where there's that kind of smoke, there's a raging inferno of prior offenses. He built his career on something, Elena. We're going to find out what it is, and we're going to use it to burn his empire to the ground." The first meeting took place in a cluttered, book-lined office that smelled of aging paper and strong coffee. It was a world away from the sterile glass and steel conference rooms of Croft Global. This was a place of intellectual grit, a war room for a different kind of battle. Professor Albright, with his wild shock of white hair and eyes that still sparkled with a fierce intelligence, had a large whiteboard already set up. In the center he had written, "Julian Croft." Radiating out from the name were spokes labeled with potential avenues of investigation: SEC filings, real estate acquisitions, offshore holdings, and early career moves. It was a spider's web, and they were about to start pulling on the threads. Elena felt a sense of homecoming that was so powerful it almost brought her to tears. She was back where she belonged, her mind engaged, her purpose clear. Albright pointed to a spoke labeled Formative Years, 2005 to 2010. "This is where we start," he said, his voice grim. "Men like Croft don't just become monsters overnight, they practice." His early career was marked by a series of aggressive, small-scale acquisitions. The official narrative is that he was a prodigy, a young lion proving his worth. I suspect the real story is much uglier. Elena's heart began to beat faster. The timeline matched perfectly. It was during that period that her father's bookstore had been targeted, squeezed, and ultimately destroyed. The signature on those documents had not been a fluke. It had been part of a pattern, one of the first bricks Julian Croft had laid in the foundation of his corrupt career. She had always known it was an injustice. Now, she had a chance to prove it was a crime. She walked to the board and picked up a red marker. Her hand was steady as she drew a new circle connected to the formative years spoke. Inside the circle, she wrote 2 words: The Story Keeper. It was the name of her father's bookstore, the name of her family's stolen legacy. It was no longer just a painful memory. It was now Exhibit A. It was the starting point of an investigation that would not end until Julian Croft was stripped of his power, his reputation, and his freedom. The waitress was gone, her uniform shed like a second skin. In her place stood a prosecutor, and she was ready to present her case. The hunt had officially begun. The initial days were a blur of intense, meticulous work. Elena, fueled by coffee and a righteous fury that had been simmering for years, plunged into the digital archives provided by Albright's organization. She was a natural, her mind moving through complex financial statements and dense legal contracts with an ease that left the project's veteran forensic accountant in awe. She was not just looking for a smoking gun, she was reconstructing a ghost. She was hunting for the faint, almost invisible trail of a series of hostile takeovers from over a decade ago. Transactions Julian Croft had personally overseen when he was just a young, ambitious executive trying to make a name for himself under the shadow of his famous father. The official records were clean, sanitized by Croft Global's army of lawyers, but Elena knew that no crime was ever truly perfect. There was always a loose thread, a forgotten memo, a disgruntled former employee. She started with what she knew best, the destruction of her father's bookstore. She pulled up the original acquisition files, documents she hadn't been able to look at for years without feeling a wave of nausea. But now, she looked at them with cold, analytical eyes. She saw the complex web of shell corporations used to buy up the debt of the store's suppliers, the predatory lending terms forced upon her father, the legal notices filed in obscure jurisdictions to minimize his chances of a successful defense. It was a masterpiece of corporate predation, designed to create the illusion of a simple business failure while being, in reality, a carefully orchestrated execution. She saw his signature again, that arrogant scrawl, and felt no pain, only a renewed sense of purpose. This document was not the end of her family's story. It was the beginning of his. Professor Albright acted as her strategic guide, a grandmaster moving pieces around the board. He used his extensive network to track down the names of other small business owners whose companies had been acquired by Croft Global during that same 5-year period. The pattern was undeniable. A beloved local hardware store in Ohio, a family-owned bakery in Pennsylvania, a small publishing house in Vermont. All of them had been pillars of their communities, all of them financially stable, and all of them had been dismantled through the same brutal, legally ambiguous tactics. Julian had not been building an empire. He had been running a corporate chop shop, buying healthy businesses for pennies on the dollar, gutting them, and selling off their real estate assets for a massive profit, leaving a trail of ruined lives and shuttered storefronts in his wake. The work was grueling. For every lead that panned out, 10 others led to dead ends. Some of the former owners had died. Others had signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements, their silence purchased for a pittance. Many were simply too broken, too afraid to revisit the most traumatic event of their lives. Elena felt their pain with every phone call, with every email that went unanswered. She was not just an investigator, she was an archaeologist of sorrow, digging through the ruins of other people's dreams. But with each story of a life upended by Julian Croft's ambition, her resolve hardened. This was bigger than her father now. This was for every family he had shattered, for every community he had hollowed out on his climb to the top. She was collecting their stories, their pain, and forging it all into a weapon of irrefutable truth. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. One of the businesses on her list was a small, independent accounting firm in Albany that had been forcibly absorbed in 2008. The owner, a man named George Tanaka, had fought back hard, launching a costly and ultimately unsuccessful lawsuit. Albright's investigators discovered that George had passed away a few years ago, but his son, Kenji, was now a mid-level analyst at a rival investment bank. He had grown up watching his father's fruitless, soul-crushing battle against the Croft machine. Albright made the call, a delicate, careful overt. The initial approach, a direct, frontal assault on Julian Croft's legal fortress, proved to be a fool's errand. For every document Elena and Albright's team requested through official channels, they received a heavily redacted file or a polite but firm rejection from a team of Croft Global's notoriously aggressive lawyers. They were stonewalled at every turn, a wall of corporate power and legal privilege rising before them, seemingly impenetrable. The small business owners they contacted were ghosts, their voices hollowed out by past trauma and the paralyzing fear of retribution. The non-disclosure agreements Julian had forced upon them were not just documents, they were chains, binding them to a lifetime of silence. Elena spent her days staring at a computer screen until the words blurred into meaningless symbols, and her nights were filled with the phantom echoes of defeated sighs and fearful whispers from the people she was trying to help. The initial fire of her determination was being tested, battered by a storm of legal barricades and human fear. She felt the crushing weight of their collective despair settling onto her own shoulders, a familiar burden that reminded her of the helplessness she had felt as her father's world crumbled around him. The first thread of hope appeared in the form of a name, Kenji Tanaka. Professor Albright's voice held a note of cautious optimism when he brought the file to her, the paper worn and slightly yellowed with age. It detailed the prolonged and ultimately failed legal battle waged by his father, George Tanaka, a man who had refused to be silenced by an NDA. He had fought until his last dollar was spent, his spirit broken, but his integrity intact. Kenji, his son, had witnessed it all. He had watched the light dim in his father's eyes, had seen the proud set of his shoulders slump into a permanent posture of defeat. He had lived through the slow, agonizing dismantling of his family's legacy. Elena studied the photograph in the file, a picture of a smiling, proud man standing in front of a modest office building. In his eyes, she saw the same quiet dignity that had once animated her own father. This was not just a lead. It was a kindred spirit, a fellow survivor of the same invisible war. The question was whether the son had inherited the father's fire, or if the battle had left him too scarred to ever want to fight again. The initial contact was delicate, a carefully worded email that was more an offering of solidarity than a request for help. Elena wrote it herself, pouring into it the shared language of law, speaking not as a lawyer, but as a daughter. She wrote of the hollow space a stolen legacy leaves behind, of the quiet anger that simmers for years beneath the surface of daily life. She didn't ask for information. She offered a listening ear. For 2 days there was only silence. Elena's hope began to wane, the fear that Kenji was another dead end gnawing at her. Then, a reply appeared in her inbox, short and cautious. He agreed to a meeting, not in an office, but on a neutral public ground, a bench in Central Park, far from any listening ears or prying eyes. It was the response of a man who had been taught from a young age that the walls had ears and that powerful people had very long arms. Elena knew this was her one chance to turn a potential ally from a fearful spectator into an active participant in the quest for justice. They met on a crisp autumn afternoon. The park, a riot of red and gold. Kenji was a man in his late 30s, his face etched with a premature weariness, his eyes carrying the old, familiar caution of someone who had learned early on that the world was not a fair place. He listened intently as Elena told her story, his gaze never leaving hers. He didn't interrupt, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his posture coiled with a tension that spoke of years of suppressed anger. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, watching the leaves drift down from the trees. "My father kept everything," he said finally, his voice low and raspy, as if unused to speaking of such things. Every letter, every threatening legal notice, every transcript of every deposition. He called it his archive of injustice. He believed that one day the truth would matter. A flicker of the old fire she had seen in his father's photograph sparked in his eyes, a tiny ember that had survived the long, cold winter of his grief. The ember, however, was not yet aflame. Kenji's hope was tempered by a deep-seated pragmatism born from watching his father's defeat. He explained that after his father's death, he had been served with a court order, a final, posthumous act of cruelty from Croft Global, demanding the return of all documents related to the lawsuit. Fearing they would come after his mother next, he had complied. He had packed up his father's entire archive, a lifetime of meticulously documented evidence, and handed it over to Croft's lawyers. He had saved nothing, not a single piece of paper. "They didn't just take his business, Ms. Reyes," Kenji said, a bitter edge to his voice. "They took his story. They erased him." The hope in Elena's chest deflated, replaced by a cold knot of frustration. They had found the perfect witness, a man with a powerful story and a deep-seated motivation for justice, but the physical evidence, the irrefutable proof, was gone, locked away in the deepest vaults of the very corporation they were trying to expose. Elena refused to accept defeat. As Kenji spoke, a different part of her mind, the part that had been trained to see the patterns beneath the surface, began to work. She listened not just to what he was saying, but how he was saying it. She heard the language of a man who had grown up in the world of finance and data. When he described the documents, he mentioned specific file formats, server protocols, and data migration projects from the mid-2000s. A new line of inquiry began to form in her mind, a path that didn't lead through a physical vault, but a digital one. She asked him about the technology Croft Global used back then, about their data storage policies, about the people who had managed their IT infrastructure during that period of aggressive expansion. Kenji's eyes lit up with a different kind of memory, the technical details flooding back to him with the clarity of a native language. He remembered names, server locations, and, most importantly, the name of the man who had overseen the entire digital transition, a brilliant but notoriously cantankerous IT administrator named Frank Lorimer. Frank Lorimer, Kenji explained, was a ghost in the corporate machine, a digital wizard who had built Croft Global's entire data infrastructure from the ground up in the early 2000s. He was a relic from a different era of the company, a time before Julian had consolidated his power. According to industry gossip Kenji had overheard, Frank had been unceremoniously forced into early retirement a few years back, replaced by a younger, cheaper team that was loyal only to Julian. He had left under a cloud of resentment, taking with him a deep and encyclopedic knowledge of every digital secret the company possessed. He was, in short, the perfect disgruntled employee, a man with the keys to the kingdom and a powerful grudge against the king. Finding him became their new, singular obsession. He was their digital skeleton key, the one person who might know where the digital copies of George Tanaka's Archive of Injustice were buried. The search for Frank Lorimer was a descent into the subculture of old-school IT professionals. He had no social media presence, no digital footprint. He was a man who understood the dangers of living a life online. Albright's investigators worked their sources, calling in favors from headhunters and tech recruiters until they finally found him. He was living a quiet life in rural New Jersey, spending his days tinkering with vintage computer hardware in his garage. When Albright and Elena finally met him, he was exactly as Kenji had described, curmudgeonly, suspicious, and deeply cynical. He listened to their story with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had no love for Julian Croft, whom he referred to only as the Princeling. But he was also terrified of the corporation's reach. He had seen what they did to people who crossed them. Elena saw the fear in his eyes, but she also saw something else, a deep, professional pride that had been wounded. Julian Croft had not just fired him. He had dismissed his life's work as obsolete. She changed her tactics, appealing not to his sense of justice, but to his ego as a master of his craft. She spoke of the elegance of the systems he had designed, using the technical jargon Kenji had provided. She asked him about specific server arrays and backup protocols, treating him not as a potential informant, but as a revered expert. She was asking him to defend his own legacy, to prove that the systems he had built were so robust, so redundant that not even a fool like Julian Croft could truly erase the data they held. The approach worked. A flicker of pride broke through his cynical exterior. He began to talk, his voice gaining energy as he described the digital fortress he had built. Frank confirmed their suspicions and then some. He explained that in his day, company policy, which he himself had written, dictated that all data from legal discovery, especially from cases the company won, was to be archived on a tertiary, off-site backup server for a period of 20 years. It was a failsafe, a CYA measure that was common practice at the time. He was almost certain that the team who had replaced him, in their haste and ignorance, would have forgotten the server even existed. It was likely sitting in a climate-controlled storage facility in Delaware, a digital time capsule of Julian Croft's earliest sins, completely off the books and forgotten by the current administration. He even remembered the server's designation, Archive 7. He didn't have direct access anymore, but he knew the architecture. He knew the back doors he himself had built into the system. The plan they formulated was audacious and fraught with risk. A direct hack was out of the question. It was too noisy, too easily traced. They needed a quieter way in. Frank explained that the server, being so old, had a physical maintenance port that could be accessed by a technician on site. It was a relic of a bygone era, a vulnerability Julian's new slick IT team would have considered beneath their notice. The problem was gaining physical access to the highly secure data storage facility. This was where Professor Albright's network became invaluable. He made a call to a former student who now worked in the Department of Justice's Cybercrime Division, presenting a hypothetical scenario, a question about legal precedent for accessing abandoned corporate data in the service of a whistleblower investigation. The answer was a carefully worded piece of advice that gave them a path forward, a way to obtain a subpoena for the server logs from the storage facility itself, a move that would be invisible to Croft Global. The subpoena was their Trojan horse. It gave a private investigator on Albright's team the legal pretext to enter the facility and inspect the server rack containing Archive 7. While the facility manager was distracted by the official paperwork, the investigator, a former NSA technician with nerves of steel, had a window of exactly 90 seconds. Following Frank's precise instructions, he inserted a small, custom-built USB device into the maintenance port. The device was not a hacking tool. It was a simple key. It was programmed with Frank's old administrative credentials and a single command: to open a secure, encrypted connection to a specific IP address for a period of 12 hours, beginning at 2 o'clock the following morning. It was a digital ghost, designed to open a door and then vanish without a trace. The investigator was in and out in under 5 minutes, the entire operation executed with surgical precision. The hours leading up to the connection felt like an eternity. Elena, Albright, Frank, and the forensic accounting team gathered in the nonprofit's war room, the air thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee. The plan was simple. Once the connection opened, they would have a 12-hour window to navigate the archaic file structure of the server, locate the Tanaka archive, and download every single file before the connection automatically severed itself. It was a digital smash and grab, a race against a ticking clock. At exactly 2 a.m., a small green light blinked on Frank's laptop. The connection was live. He cracked his knuckles, a wry smile on his face. "Let's go see what the princeling tried to bury," he said, and began to type. The screen filled with lines of code, a digital incantation that was unlocking a decade of secrets. Navigating the old server was like exploring a sunken ship. The file directories were a labyrinth of outdated naming conventions and forgotten project folders. Frank was their guide, his fingers flying across the keyboard, his memory of the system's architecture proving to be flawless. He bypassed security protocols he himself had designed 20 years earlier, moving through the digital corridors with an eerie familiarity. Elena sat beside him, her heart pounding in her chest, calling out file names and keywords from Kenji's memory of his father's archive. They were a team, a strange fusion of old-school tech and new-school legal fury, working in perfect sync. The minutes stretched into hours as they dug deeper and deeper into the server's memory banks, a digital excavation of a corporate crime scene. Meanwhile, a continent away, in a sleek, minimalist office overlooking the glittering lights of Hong Kong, Julian Croft was growing uneasy. Professor Albright, as part of their strategy, had used a trusted contact at the Wall Street Journal to plant a small, innocuous story. It was a filler piece, buried deep in the business section, about a renewed academic interest in the aggressive acquisition tactics of the early 2000s. It mentioned no names, made no direct accusations, but it was enough. An underling brought the article to Julian's attention, and a cold sliver of paranoia pierced through his armor of arrogance. The timing felt wrong. It felt too close to the incident at the restaurant. He remembered the waitress's eyes, the unnerving confidence in her voice. He had dismissed her as a nobody, but the memory of his public humiliation still stung. He made a call to his head of security. "I want a full digital sweep," he commanded. "Review all access logs for our deep archive servers. Now, something isn't right." The order came too late. Back in New York, a folder name flashed on the screen that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. Tanaka_G_legal_disk. Frank clicked on it, and the directory opened, revealing hundreds of scanned PDF files. It was all there. The threatening letters, the fraudulent appraisals, the depositions where George Tanaka's spirit was slowly ground down by Croft's lawyers. It was the entire archive of injustice, perfectly preserved in digital amber. They began the download, the progress bar on the screen moving with agonizing slowness, each percentage point a small victory. They were pulling the truth, bite by bite, out of the darkness and into the light. The sheer volume of data was immense, a testament to how hard George Tanaka had fought. Then, they found it. Buried in a subfolder labeled Internal Memos was a file that had never been intended for outside eyes. It was a memorandum written by a young, ambitious Julian Croft to his father, Alistair. The subject line was chilling in its corporate banality. Strategy for legacy asset liquidation. In the memo, Julian outlined, with undisguised pride, the very predatory legal strategy he had used to crush the small businesses. He referred to the owners not as people but as soft targets and non-performing assets. He described the tactic of burying them in legal fees as, quote, attritional litigation. And then, in the final paragraph, a sentence that made the blood run cold in Elena's veins. Regarding the bookstore, he had written, the owner's sentimental attachment makes him a high risk for protracted litigation. Recommend we accelerate the debt leveraging strategy to force insolvency before he can mount a meaningful defense. This will neutralize the asset and send a clear message to the others. It was the smoking gun. It was more than just proof of a crime. It was a window into the blackness of Julian Croft's soul. He had not just destroyed her father's business. He had done it with cold, calculated, and documented malice. He had targeted him specifically, seeing his love for his bookstore not as a virtue, but as a weakness to be exploited. Elena felt a wave of nausea, followed by a surge of pure, unadulterated resolve. This document was not just evidence. It was a death sentence for Julian Croft's career. She looked at the download progress bar. 98%. A frantic message suddenly flashed on Frank's screen. It was an automated alert from the server. A high-level administrative query had just been initiated from Croft Global's main network. Julian's sweep had begun. They were about to be discovered. "Cut the connection," Albright ordered, his voice sharp. "Now!" Frank terminated the link just as the download completed, the last file clicking into place. They were clear. The digital door slammed shut just as Julian's security team began to knock. They had the evidence, all of it. The memos, the depositions, the proof of a systematic, predatory campaign orchestrated by Julian Croft himself. The room was silent for a moment. The only sound, the low hum of the computers. Then, a slow smile spread across Professor Albright's face. "He has no idea what's coming," he said quietly. Elena looked at the file on her screen, the cold, cruel words of Julian's memo burning into her memory. She now held his entire world in her hands. The final stage of the plan began to take shape. They had the weapon, now they needed the perfect stage to unveil it. Albright's team discovered that the annual Croft Global Charity Gala, a lavish, high-profile event designed to whitewash the company's reputation, was scheduled in 2 weeks. It was the perfect venue, a temple built to celebrate the very philanthropy Julian was actively trying to sabotage. It was an arena of his own making, filled with his peers, the media, and the board of directors. It was the ideal place to turn his greatest public relations triumph into his most humiliating public execution. Albright used his connections at the Journal to secure Elena a press pass under an assumed name. She would not be a guest or a server. She would be a journalist, with a seat at the table and, more importantly, a guaranteed question during the CEO's keynote address. The days leading up to the gala were a whirlwind of preparation. Elena did not just study the evidence. She absorbed it, memorized it, made it a part of her. She rehearsed her question, honing it into a verbal dagger, sharp, precise, and undeniable. She worked with a public speaking coach, learning to control her breathing, to project an aura of unshakable confidence. This was not just about presenting facts. It was a performance. She had to transform herself one last time, from the invisible waitress to the brilliant lawyer to, finally, the avenging angel of justice. She chose her outfit with the same meticulous care she had used to analyze the legal documents, a simple, elegant, dark blue suit. It was not the uniform of a servant or the armor of a warrior. It was the attire of a professional, a woman who belonged in that room, not because of wealth or status, but because of the sheer, undeniable power of the truth she was about to unleash. On the night of the gala, Elena stood before the mirror in her small Queens apartment. The woman looking back at her was someone she barely recognized. The fear that had haunted her for years was gone, replaced by a calm, cold certainty. The grief for her father had not vanished, but it had been transformed from a crushing weight into a source of incredible strength. She was not just doing this for him anymore. She was doing it for George Tanaka, for Kenji, for every nameless victim whose life had been casually destroyed by the man who would be celebrated as a philanthropist tonight. She picked up the small, encrypted flash drive containing the evidence. It felt heavy in her hand, heavy with the weight of stolen stories and shattered dreams. She slipped it into her pocket. The stage was set. The audience was waiting. The final act was about to begin. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was not merely a room, it was a cathedral of commerce, a gilded testament to the power of capital. The air, thick with the scent of 1,000 hothouse lilies and expensive perfume, hummed with a low, confident murmur, the sound of 100 private deals being sealed between sips of champagne. Light from chandeliers the size of small automobiles rained down upon the assembled guests, catching on the facets of diamonds and the polished gleam of $100,000 watches. It was a symphony of self-congratulation, a glittering ecosystem where predators in bespoke tuxedos and shimmering gowns celebrated their place at the top of the food chain. Elena moved through this opulent jungle not with the furtive invisibility of a servant, but with the quiet, deliberate purpose of a hunter. Her simple dark suit was an island of sobriety in a sea of ostentatious wealth, and it gave her a strange kind of power. She was not one of them, and she was no longer pretending to be. In her pocket, the small flash drive felt as dense and powerful as a singularity, a tiny object containing the truth that would collapse this entire glittering universe into a black hole of its own making. Her heart was a steady, rhythmic drum, no longer pounding with fear, but with the calm, focused energy of a marathon runner entering the final mile. She was a ghost at this feast, but tonight, she would not be the one to disappear. Julian Croft took the stage to a thunderous, sustained applause, the sound washing over him like a physical benediction. He stood at the podium, bathed in the warm glow of a spotlight, a modern-day king surveying his loyal subjects. He was the picture of success, his smile broad and confident, his gestures practiced and expansive. He began his speech, his voice smooth and resonant, weaving a grand narrative of corporate responsibility and compassionate capitalism. He spoke of the Croft Global Foundation, the very entity he was actively trying to defraud, as his father's greatest legacy, a torch he was honored to carry forward. The hypocrisy was so profound, so utterly shameless, that Elena felt a cold, clarifying calm settle over her. She watched him, not as a victim, but as a scientist observing a specimen in the final moments before an experiment's dramatic conclusion. As he wrapped up his speech with a flourish, calling for questions, Elena began her walk toward the microphone set up in the center aisle. Each step was measured, her heels making no sound on the thick Persian carpet. She could feel the ripple of curiosity in the room as heads turned. She was an unknown, an anomaly in this carefully curated world. She reached the microphone, her hand steady as she adjusted it, the cool metal, a grounding force. Julian's eyes found hers, and for a fraction of a second, a flicker of recognition, of pure, undiluted contempt, crossed his face. He remembered the waitress. He smirked, a silent, arrogant dismissal. "Mr. Croft," Elena began, her voice perfectly amplified, cutting through the lingering applause with the clarity of a ringing bell. Elena Reyes, with the Financial Chronicle. She used the press pass credentials, a simple statement of fact that immediately established her right to be there. "You speak eloquently about honoring your father's legacy. I'd like to ask you about a different kind of legacy, the one you built early in your career." Julian's smile tightened at the edges, the easy confidence in his eyes replaced by a flicker of irritation. He had been expecting soft, fawning questions from friendly journalists. Not this. "Specifically," Elena continued, her tone remaining flawlessly professional, "I'd like to ask you about a small bookstore in Northwood, New York, called The Storykeeper, a business you personally acquired in 2007 through a series of shell corporations and what your own internal memos referred to as attritional litigation." A gasp rippled through the front rows of the audience. On the massive screen behind Julian, which had been displaying the shimmering logo of the foundation, a new image suddenly appeared. A scanned copy of the first page of the foreclosure document, with Julian Croft's arrogant, youthful signature clearly visible at the bottom. The image had been sent from the flash drive by a technician on Albright's team, perfectly timed to her words. The blood began to drain from Julian's face as he stared, uncomprehending, at the ghost of a crime he thought he had buried more than a decade ago. His first instinct was to bluster, to deny. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he stammered, his voice losing its smooth, practiced cadence. "This is an absurd, baseless accusation." He gestured dismissively at the screen, a king trying to wave away a rebellion. But Elena was relentless, her next words a hammer blow to his crumbling defense. "Perhaps this will refresh your memory, Mr. Croft." The document on the screen changed. It was now the internal memorandum, the one she had memorized, the one that had been her fuel through these long weeks. She began to quote from it, her voice steady and clear, each word an indictment. "Regarding the bookstore," she recited, her eyes locked on his, "the owner's sentimental attachment makes him a high risk for protracted litigation. Recommend we accelerate the debt leveraging strategy to force insolvency before he can mount a meaningful defense. This will neutralize the asset and send a clear message to the others." The room fell into a profound, deathly silence. The words hung in the air, stripped of their corporate jargon, revealing the cold, reptilian soul of the man on the stage. She had not just accused him of a crime. She had shown the entire world his character. She had let him condemn himself with his own monstrous words. Julian stared at the screen, his mouth agape, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The spotlight that had been his coronation was now an interrogation lamp, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. The collapse was total and instantaneous. The carefully constructed facade of Julian Croft, the philanthropist, the titan of industry, the worthy son, shattered into a million pieces. He began to babble, incoherent phrases about doctored evidence and corporate espionage, but his words were drowned out by the rising tide of murmurs and frantic whispers in the ballroom. Members of the Croft Global Board of Directors were on their feet, their faces a mixture of fury and panic. The flash of cameras, once a symbol of his celebrity, now felt like a barrage of tiny explosions, each one capturing a new angle of his utter ruin. He stumbled back from the podium, his hand clutching at his chest, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. His eyes, wild and terrified, scanned the crowd, searching for an ally, for an escape, but found only a sea of horrified and accusatory faces. And then his gaze landed on Elena, still standing calmly at the microphone, her expression not of triumph, but of a sad, solemn finality. In that moment, he finally understood. This was not about money or business. This was a reckoning. His arrogance had been a loaded gun he had pointed at the world for years, and he had finally, fatally, turned it upon himself. Security guards began to move toward the stage, their movements calm but resolute. The king was being deposed in his own court, his reign ending not with a bang, but with the pathetic, whimpering sound of a man who had just lost everything. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Elena finally exposed the truth. The weeks that followed were a maelstrom of consequences. The gala expose was a media firestorm, a story of corporate greed and hubris so perfect it dominated the news cycle for days. The SEC, armed with the mountain of evidence Elena and Albright's team provided, launched a massive investigation into Croft Global, freezing assets and subpoenaing decades of records. The board, in a desperate act of self-preservation, fired Julian Croft publicly and unceremoniously, issuing a statement that condemned his actions and severed all ties. But the most profound blow came from a place Julian never expected. His father, Alistair Croft, from his bed in a private hospital wing, had been shown a recording of the gala. With one of his last acts of lucid strength, he summoned his lawyers. He completely disinherited his son, stripping him of every dollar, every share of stock, every last vestige of the power he had so desperately craved. The entire $40 billion Croft fortune, along with control of the company, was placed into the charitable trust his son had tried to cheat. Julian Croft, the man who had been born on top of the world, was left with nothing but his name, a name that was now synonymous with disgrace. A month later, Elena sat in a sleek, sunlit corner office high above the city. It was not the gilded cage of the gilded scepter, but a place of quiet, focused purpose. After the dust had settled, the newly empowered board of the Croft Foundation had made her an offer. They hadn't just been impressed by her legal brilliance. They had been moved by her unwavering integrity. They had created a new position for her, Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, with a mandate to ensure that the Foundation's vast resources were used not just for charity, but for justice. She was given the power to investigate and fund projects that helped people like her father, victims of corporate predation who had nowhere else to turn. It was the job she had been born to do, the career that had been stolen from her, now returned 100-fold. She was no longer fighting a defensive war to keep her father alive. She was now on the offensive, armed with a multi-billion-dollar war chest to protect the powerless and hold the arrogant accountable. The quiet hum of the city below was no longer a sound of mockery, but a symphony of possibility. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, she sat by her father's bedside in the sun-drenched room of the best care facility in the state. The costs no longer a crushing weight, but a simple, easy expense. He was the same, his body still, his eyes distant. But as she read to him from one of his favorite old books, a classic tale of adventure and quiet heroism, she saw his fingers twitch. His eyes slowly turned to meet hers, and for a fleeting, beautiful moment, a flicker of the old light, of recognition, of pride, shone through the fog. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. He could not speak, but he understood. His story had not ended in tragedy. His daughter had taken the legacy of his name, the love of stories he had instilled in her, and the education he had sacrificed for, and she had written a new, triumphant final chapter for them both. She had not just won a battle, she had restored his honor, and in doing so she had finally, truly, found her own. She was no longer a ghost, no longer a victim. She was the story keeper, and she was just getting started. If Elena's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.